Good day everyone, so hope you're doing well. So on today's topic we'll talk about iframing and spacing, a topic not a lot of people really talk about. So what is iframing? Well, it's essentially the ability for you to avoid damage by pressing the dash button at the correct moment. Now, a couple of important things to note about the iframing is you can't just successively do it. There is a bit of a cooldown between successive dashes. That is unless you're using someone like Ayaka or Mona, in which case you can do lots of successive dashes one after the other. A typical character, assuming you've got a full 240 stamina, has got about 12 dashes that they can do. Mona and Ayaka are the exceptions, they've got 24. And then characters like Yae Miko can essentially move stamina free, so in other words, without needing to expend any stamina, and then they can dash around the field. But Yae Miko's dash is a bit different because it's not a dash, it's actually a spacing tool, and hopefully this will become clear like right towards the end. Now, one thing about dashing is that you can't do it whilst being halfway submerged, so no matter how much you try and press the dash button, you can't move in like the terrain, but movement abilities, for instance, like with Yae Miko's E, can certainly do so. Now, let's go get an enemy and let me sort of show you a couple of practical examples when it comes to iframing and like how to space. So yeah, you can see we didn't take any corrosion damage or whatsoever with Yae Miko. Essentially, when the enemy attacks us, we're dashing right at the correct moment and none of the corrosion is applied to us. In effect, we avoided the physical damage as well as the corrosion effect, and of course you can do the same with Ayaka in her alternative sprint. The dashing animation is the same in both cases. Now, one of the other interesting things is it's not just attacks that are nearby, but also ranged attacks. For instance, like this, you can see Yae Miko very clearly sort of iframed it, and it was pretty easy to do so. And then we just sort of spaced back there, and then we can finish off the enemy. Pretty nice. So let's go into a bit of a more like fun, funky scenario with the Primo Geovish and see this in like more more practical action. So this little guy attacks quite a lot, so you'll see me iframing him. So whoop, it doesn't matter, he's like trying to hit us. Be careful because his hand can like sort of retract, and even if you do iframe that first one, the hand coming back can hit you on the way out. But there you go, pretty easy. And now what we can do is we can just sort of quickly dash out, or in other words space out with Yae Miko's E ability without having to waste stamina to run back out and then run back in, which is pretty cool. And you can see here now what we're going to do with Yae Miko is we're just going to space around the enemy, so we're not going to iframe him in any sort of way. All we're going to do is like very early before he launches his attacks, we're just going to sort of press our E ability and effectively move out of the way. This is the concept of spacing. So spacing is all about positioning yourself properly in order to enable yourself to either attack the enemies, avoid damage, avoid sort of status afflictions, or even just to set up the proper play. And I'll show a couple of examples later. The thing is, spacing is a tool that when used properly can really effectively enable you. So if you use Yae Miko's spacing tool, her E ability, incorrectly, you'll get something like what you'll see in the background. Rosario casting a burst, and then you will complain, oh my god, the E's need some iframing, blah blah blah. And this is not how you use Yae. So if you see someone playing Yae like this, just tell them they don't know what they're doing. So the correct play here is to space out with Yae Miko and then to space in whilst the enemies are casting their animation. Use your burst animation to overlap with them and then take them out. The cool thing about Yae Miko is that her spacing allows her to sort of attack as well as sort of get out of the way, out of harm. Whereas with iframing, you can get out of harm's way by proper timing, but you can't attack at the same time unless you're Ayaka, but that's a different topic. So with regards to iframing and applying elements, if you've looked at what Yae Miko's done right here, at the end of her dash the wet status was applied. It wasn't applied when she immediately touched the water. This is in contrast to just plain walking into the water. You can see here the moment she touches the water, it's immediately applied. Now, in a certain sense, this looks to be like completely useless and pointless. Why would I show this? Well, remember how we iframed corrosion? That's the exact same principle. So certain enemies can apply, for instance, electro and cryo onto your character, and if you just iframe properly, you can avoid that entirely, which is completely amazing. Now, this sort of iframing does not apply to your elemental burst. So if you cast your elemental burst, the enemies can still, for instance, afflict you with pyro, even if though you're not taking any damage, which is quite interesting. So you'll see here with Yae, we're in our elemental burst, and if we had any energy, that energy would have been sapped as well, even though we haven't taken any damage. Some of the more advanced things that you can do with this little trick is you can actually iframe with sucrose, get an enemy to apply status onto sucrose, and then you can self-swirl your own little butterfly on the field. It's a technique that I've used in the past somewhere in one of my older videos. It's pretty fun. The problems with iframing, as much as I try to sort of sell it to you guys at the moment, is that iframing itself, because of the fact that you can't just continuously or immediately dash or like spam the dash button, is that after iframing there's a very short period in which you are still vulnerable before applying your next sort of dash or iframe. And you can see here, and I think we'll just wait for Bishop to attack Yae. We'll iframe the first attack, but then you'll see subsequently we've been sort of hit. So iframing is very useful to avoid attacks, but this is where spacing becomes so much better, because by positioning yourself properly, you can avoid the damage in the first instance, and you can be in a position where you can only be hit by, let's say, one instance instead of multiple instances of attacks, which you will fail to iframe. So a good example is, look at this, we're avoiding attacks, and yeah, the sort of internal dash cooldown sort of just kicked in and we couldn't avoid the corrosion, which is pretty interesting. Now you might tell me, well, spacing is not really that powerful, I'm just going to ride Raiden, Eula, Bennett, all these characters, I'm just going to slap them, look at that, 370k Raiden slash, that's what I want. Spacing, iframing, none of these things matter. Well, they kind of do, because if you're a very veteran player or someone that's very experienced in the Spiral Abyss, you'd probably be cringing right now at the gameplay that you're seeing. And yes, this is deliberately done, because if you've noticed very carefully, look at how much time we wasted by being at the wrong place at the wrong time. And yes, money and constellation, C6 Raiden, C6 Eula is not going to fix this. It's not, look at it, it's just completely bad. So by understanding how to iframe and to space properly, we can actually fix this situation. So let me sort of show you. The first thing is, we're not just going to wait, we're just going to look at this. We're just going to wait slowly, and we're going to iframe that, go with Kujusara. This is the proper spacing that you should use. Hit all 4 enemies at the same time, and look at that, very easy to clear. And now we can go into Eula, avoid applying the electro to the enemies, otherwise they're going to get enraged, and yeah, that'll send them on a frenzy and so on. And I want you to notice this now after Eula's attack. Look at what I'm going to do with Raiden Shogun. Look at that quick 180 flick, because I knew the enemy would go behind me. So positioning, spacing, where you stand, where your character is facing, when you're pressing the iframing button, when you are pressing the Yae Miko E button, like look at this, very early. These things matter. These things all add up to sort of give you better clearing times. And I know a lot of people might be skeptical and be like, well, I can just freeze the enemies, I can just use Zhongli, I can just use shields and so on. But this is the thing, MiHoYo is bringing out enemies that are constantly moving, so you either have to stagger or put them into place. You've got enemies that are draining your elemental burst, enemies that are afflicting corrosion. Even if you can try and iframe with your elemental burst, it's not going to work. The game is starting to be open up. It's the days that you just stand still in a Bennett circle and sort of hit enemies are like those days are gone. This is the wonderful thing about having enemies like these new Vishaps, having a more dynamic environment of enemies attacking you. And by understanding how you should move, how you should space, is like so important. If you've been paying attention, you would have noticed that I try to keep like a sort of close distance so that Xinyan's barrier, when it blazes, can apply pyro to the enemies and stagger them. This is the essence. I'm positioning, I'm dodging, I'm moving with Yae, I'm applying certain elements at a certain place onto the enemies. There's lots of technical gameplay going on, and this allows a team that is not very strong to suddenly do a lot of damage. And this is the thing that theory crafters won't tell you, because they've got spreadsheets. They assume it's a sort of average energy regeneration and a static enemy that you can hit. But in practice, enemies move around, and this is why people struggle so much with Sukokumon, because in addition to executing your abilities properly, the enemies are making life very difficult. And hopefully you guys now understand the concept of spacing, the concept of how to use iframes, and like there is a bit of an art to using when to using which and how to position properly. But if anything, hopefully this guide would have helped all of you, and you would have appreciated Yae Miko for being such an awesome character and allowing you to navigate the battlefield much more successfully. Cheers.